Good Up is a safe space for casual, cultural, and controversial life topics for people of all ages from the Afro-Caribbean and American lens. It's your Tuesday reminder that no matter where your walk in life takes you, you're good up bad. The show is hosted and produced by Deidre Ritter and Heiza Quinones Ivory, and is a proud member of the Kickin' It family. Follow us on social media at Good Up Pod. Use hashtag Good Up Tuesday to join the conversation. And visit us over at patreon.com/gooduppodcast to join our Patreon family and get exclusive access to bonus content.
Sis, I don't think I understand. You got up bad. Like, hello.
Hey, girl.
Hey.
So,
how you doing?
I'm good. How are you feeling? How has life been? How are things? Are you ready for this topic for tonight?
Listen. In the spirit of transparency, in this very moment, I'm great. Last 2 days, oh my God, what was life? Don't know, but I'm better today.
This has been a rough 2 fucking weeks. I'll tell you that much. Like,
hasn't it?
It's been a little ghetto over here, but you know what? I think tonight is going to be a good event session. We are going to talk about a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. So I don't know. I think I need tonight's topic. I need to talk about tonight's topic. So
well, we're gonna do
it's
it.
going to be a good one.
Do it tonight.
All right. So in this, since you did the honors, and this is part 3 of sort of this series of like self-reflection, betterment, shadow work, all that stuff. I gonna give you the floor to introduce tonight's topic. So tell them about these boundaries, girl.
Lord. So tonight, that's it. We're talking about boundaries. What it looks like, what it feels like, whether or not we have them. I feel like a lot of people who grew up in the Caribbean don't know what boundaries are. That's just the reality. And so we're talking about what boundaries look like in our lives. Do we have boundaries up? And if we don't, how we can start having them. You want to go first, girl?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start the conversation off with a question. So,
okay,
what are some examples of boundaries?
This is my personal opinion. This ain't from Webster's dictionary or nothing. But I think at the very core of it, boundaries are essentially, I don't want to like the word guidelines, but boundaries are essentially just conditions, right? Based on what you can and cannot accept when communicating and dealing with others. So barriers, that's a good word, but just guidelines, if you will, what can and can't work between you and others, based on your own personal existence, right? And your own personal needs. That's what I see boundaries as. I didn't do my Googles.
I mean, boundaries literally define themselves, right? So boundaries are essentially you're building a non-existent wall, a hypothetical wall around yourself. You can have physical boundaries, you can have emotional boundaries, you can have boundaries in relationships, you can have boundaries in platonic friendships, you can have boundaries with your family. Boundaries, I like to call it my no-no square. So
I like that.
And it's kind of funny because like the term no-no square, the first time I heard it, it was in relation to like, hey, don't touch me there, this is my no-no square. Like there's a song like that, like, but
really,
yeah. But I call boundaries my no-no square because I like to picture, an actual like square that I put myself in. Yeah. And when I think of setting boundaries, I think of, like you said, those guidelines for, hey, in order for us to have this relationship, these are these specific lines that you can't cross in order for me to feel comfortable and safe and happy in this relationship with you. So I don't know. Let's throw it back. When was the first time you can recall setting a boundary? And at the time that you did that, did you recognize it as a boundary?
Oh, baby. Honestly, I'm sure earlier in my life, there were times where I set boundaries and I didn't realize that that's what it was. But the reality, and this is just me being honest about myself, I only recently realized that boundaries were so necessary. I realized that for my whole life, I never had boundaries with people. Um, Very boundless, this one. And it got me into a lot of trouble. And when I say I didn't have boundaries with people, I didn't create boundaries so that people could respect my boundaries. It was weird. It was this like one-way street where I would very, very, very easily respect other people's boundaries. People didn't even really have to set boundaries with me. I just, like that like dog collars where if the dog, it's like creates this invisible fence where if the dog tries to cross, they get a little like electric shock. That's how I used to be, where I would never like cross people or anything like that. But I never created boundaries so people don't cross me, because I just used to be such a people pleaser. And I feel like I've shared this on the show before that I consider myself a recovering people pleaser because, baby, I could remember times where me and Diamond were like kids and teenagers where she'd ask me to do something and I would say no because I genuinely couldn't, but I would feel so bad. Like I would be harassing her for like the next hour. Like, are you mad at me? Are you mad at me? Please don't be mad at me because I said no. Like I was that girl. And so.
And that's the important part of setting boundaries is embracing the ability to say no as a complete sentence with a period at the end.
And I would always think that if I said no, people would get mad at me. And I'm not going to talk about the root of that because y'all could listen to episode 1 for that.
I can't even talk about the root of that because I still need therapy to examine the root of that right now. So
so I spent pretty much my whole life not realizing that I also should have been setting boundaries with people. So I want to say maybe in the last year and a half is when I've started to, and even I feel like that's a bit of a stretch. I should say more so in the last maybe 8 to 9 months is when I started to truly set boundaries, mean it, and just be like, whatever. Up to maybe a few weeks ago, I had to set a boundary and I felt a little nauseous after, I'm not gonna lie. Like I was on the phone venting to my girlfriends, feeling a little guilty, and they're like, it's uncomfortable right now, but you know what, D? The long-term effects of what you would have been feeling had you not set that boundary would have felt way worse than these few minutes that you're feeling the way you feel. So to answer the question, after all those words, I only just recently started setting boundaries. So I'm still learning.
So before I share mine, let's dive into different types of boundaries. I kind of touched on them earlier, but I Googled. So you can have emotional boundaries, which means you're trying to protect your own emotional well-being. You can have physical boundaries, which means you're trying to protect your physical space. You can have sexual boundaries, which means you are protecting your needs and your safety as it relates to your sexuality and sex. You can have workplace boundaries, which is protecting your ability to do your work without interference or drama. You can have material boundaries, which is protecting your personal belongings. And then you can have time boundaries, so protecting the use and misuse of your time. So listen, in reading that list, I'm like, shit, I didn't have nobody type of boundaries growing up, like none. And I fully feel you there in terms of the lack of boundaries being related to me being a people pleaser and feeling like if I set a boundary, I would make someone mad, or me somehow establishing a boundary and saying no to something was me disappointing a person. Right. And I think that's it for a lot of people. Like a lot of the times when we have I think more people have difficulty setting boundaries with people that they love and people they have good relationships with versus people that they historically maybe have negative interactions with. Like in my life, if there's a person I don't like and they cross me in the wrong way, like, bitch, let's fight. Like, you crossed the boundary, let's go. Or I'll tell you about yourself because I don't even have to think twice about it. But when it comes to like family, friends, partners, romantic interests, like setting boundaries there has been hard. The first time I remember setting a boundary was in high school. I had to basically end a friendship with essentially my best friend in high school.
I feel like we know about this from a previous episode, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Oof, baby.
So
that must have made you sick.
Yeah. She crossed a really, 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 really like solid boundary for me. Like
Yeah.
she was fully aware of like how deeply I had been affected by a situation that had harmed me
Mm-hmm.
and chose to continue interacting and actually dating the person who had harmed me. So
Baby.
in response to what she did, I literally had to like end the friendship and like express myself and say, I cannot continue to be friends with you if you are dating this person because this person harmed me. Like this person brought like harm into my life. So you being my friend would also do the same thing. And like that was the first time I remember me not, you know, in like a dramatic way, not that we were like arguing and fighting. Like I explicitly expressed like we can't be the friends that we used to be and this is exactly why.
Yeah.
Um and like you said, listen, I felt physically sick. I felt like, oh my God, what did I do? Should I go back? Should I fix it? She gonna be vexed with me. And it
Mm.
was for years. Like I kept looking back, like, did I do that the right way? Like, was I wrong? And obviously, you know, there's layers of things involved in that. But establishing a boundary was such a strange territory for me that
Yeah.
like it felt wrong. Like
Mm-hmm.
it felt like, what the fuck did I just do? But
Damn.
yeah, and I think because of how I felt in response to that situation, I had difficulty setting boundaries after that because I always felt like, am I going to lose this friend forever if I establish a boundary? Like, will this be the end of my
Right.
friendship with this person? So, have you ever had like a negative response to you setting an emotional or physical or however, you know, boundary with somebody?
Yes. Um, shit, I'm trying. Oh, for God, I feel like this just gonna keep leading back to my mama. Like, you know what? And regardless of who, my mother, other family members, friends, even lovers, anybody who I had a hard time setting boundaries with, you know, in the past, once I got to that point where I got comfortable and started setting boundaries, it was like a shock to people. And naturally, their first reaction would be, why are you overreacting? Why are you acting like this? You doing a lot would be certain responses that I would get to me setting boundaries because it was not, they weren't used to it. You know what I mean? Everybody who I was interacting with, at least at that time, who was still a part of my life, they were so used to me just rolling over and letting them have their way with me. So once I got to the point where I'm like, hey, that thing that you just did, don't like it, I would be met with, oh, you overreacting or something of the sort.
People don't like, even us, even people who understand boundaries, people don't like being told when they're crossing a boundary. People don't like the feeling of this person has established this line that I can't cross. Like it's not a good
Mm-hmm.
feeling even being on the other end of someone setting a boundary. Like
Yeah.
people don't like it. um it like I said, the shit don't feel good. But I'm trying to think. Honestly, I think everyone who I've ever set a boundary with has had a negative response. Um has seen it as like, I don't know. I guess I can't speak for them, but I feel like sometimes people see it as like, oh, so we're not friends in the same way, or like this somehow changes our
Mm-hmm.
relationship. And like, it doesn't have to. I just think that in order for people to learn how to set and respect boundaries, they need to also accept the fact that like you don't own someone. You don't
Right.
have unlimited access to someone's emotions, to someone's physical body, to someone's, you
Right.
know, workspace. Like, you know, marriage, relationship, no matter how close you are to a person, like you have an identical twin, and I'm still sure that there are boundaries between you and her that you guys establish and have to respect despite you coming into the world together. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people learning how to respect boundaries or learning how to accept that boundaries exist
Mm-hmm.
goes back to this idea that like people think that they should be able to access you and have control over how they interact with you at all times.
Right. With people that I don't know very well, and it makes it's, you know, back to what you were saying earlier, it's easier to set boundaries with people you don't know very well, right? And with strangers, because you know, there's different variations of us setting boundaries. Something as simple as not accepting an appointment because you're not available at that time. That's an example of setting a boundary. But with someone that you're like comfortable with. I want to say one good example would, you know what, this dude that I recently like just kind of stopped talking to. I find myself realizing that majority of our conversations are just me kind of helping him through stuff. And I had to really, and this is more so a boundary I had to set with myself. Like, yes, I know that part of my job description is intuitive healer, right? But there's a point where I do have to turn that off. And in my history with dating and just my relationships with people in general, friendship, whatever, there's always this version of that relationship that turns into me helping people through things and being there, you know what I mean? And I had to be like, okay, this is happening too much. That's number one. But number two, I started to feel almost as though he was kind of discarding me. And when I say that, it was like he would have something going on and be like, sorry, D, I can't talk. I got this, whatever it is going on, and blah, blah, blah. And that's fine. And I get that, right? We all sometimes have something going on where we're not able to talk. But then I started to realize that was happening too much. And I'm like, you know what? This is not for me.
And it was like the access that he wanted to you to be able to sort of like vent and receive your input on like his issues, you weren't receiving back from him. So it wasn't necessarily a mutual exchange.
Right.
Like,
Now, granted, if there was ever something where I needed some kind of like, you know, understanding or an ear, he would make himself available when he wasn't going through whatever he was going. He always had something going on, basically. But what I noticed is that it was as though he would call me for certain things. And that's the thing. I don't want to be called every time you have something going on, but I don't want every single thing we talk about to be whatever drama you have going on at the time in your life, right? And I also don't want to just be placed on a shelf when you're having your feelings or whatever. And for me, I'm naturally a very understanding person. I get the space in life where you're at. And so for that, it's best that I just remove myself from the equation because my role is not to just be grabbed and put back based on your needs and your experience. There's a certain amount of availability that you don't have, and that's fine. So I'm not going to try to force you to be available in the way that I would like you to be. And I'm not going to kick up a shit storm because you're not. You know what I mean? So I just got to a point where I just was like, you know what? Let me just remove myself from the equation.
yeah, I can totally relate. I think one of the hardest boundaries for me to set has been in that role of like being a supportive friend.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people don't realize that a boundary can also be being honest with your friend about the fact that sometimes you just don't have it in you right now to take on their stuff. And it doesn't mean you don't love them. It doesn't mean you don't want to be there for them. It just means like right here and now, like I'm dealing with my own shit today, or I just don't have it in me today to take on emotion from another person.
Right.
Sometimes people don't realize that, you know, as friends, we vent to each other and we share what we're going through and we talk about our experiences. But like, we don't realize how just venting can be kind of like, I trying to hide from things like emotional transfer and things like that. But it
Is.
it can definitely be that. Like, you think that you're just sharing what happened to you, but like if you're sharing it with someone who genuinely cares about you, then they're taking that on while you're venting, right? And
Absolutely.
sometimes your friends have space for it and sometimes they don't.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I've noticed people doing more of and talking more about is the reality of that, and the reality of like, how do you tell your friend like, yo, I want to be here for you today, but I don't
Mm-hmm.
have it in me? And like, how do you set that boundary without making your friend feel like, damn, like nobody here for me? With me, that's been a
Mm-hmm.
struggle because like
Mm-hmm.
I have friends who deal with depression and like mental health issues. I have friends who have dealt with like suicidal ideations and things like that.
Yeah.
So I'm always afraid of this idea of like,
Mm.
hey, I want to be here for you, but I need to set this boundary right now because I today is just not a good day for me. And like
Uh-huh.
I'm afraid that one day I do that and that
As
something
somebody.
happens. Yeah, something happens to like a friend, you know, they were in a desperate situation. Like
Yeah.
that's really why I have trouble setting that boundary.
So one thing I would do, and this is something that me and my own friends have implemented. For one, me and my best friend from freshman year of college, um, I remember that we had this falling out a little over a year ago. And during the falling out, I remember there was a lot of miscommunication. I'm not going to get into what we fell out about and the he said, she said, and the bullshit behind it. But I remember her reaching out to me. And for the first time, I wasn't in a space to hear what she had to say. And so, and of course, out of frustration and anger, I was like, I don't have anything in me to give to you right now, or something like that. I said. She was like, fine. We later talked about it. I was like, I just feel like I'm always the one who's there for you, but you're never there for me. And then she also let me to know, well, you don't ever share nothing with me. Like, you always point on this. So that was a lesson that I had to learn, and I had to really learn how to remove that barrier. That's one layer. But two, one thing we do is when we call each other to vent about things, before we just get to venting, we ask, are you in a good place to hear what I have to say right now, or to hear what I've got going on? Even remember at the beginning of the episode, I was like, girl, 2 days ago, it was a mess over here. One of my best friends, I called her and I was like, are you in the right energy space to hear me vent? Like, and she was like, of course, you know what I mean? And so maybe you and your friends could establish that. Maybe when nobody has anything going on, you could just say, hey, I was just, I'm learning about boundaries and things such as that. What do you guys say moving forward? If any of us need to vent to each other, we just double check with whoever we call on first. You know what I mean?
I have a relationship like that with at least one of my friends, and he's probably the person I talk to besides my husband. Like, I talk to him most out of everybody. And we do vent to each other a lot because mental health wise, like, we've experienced the same things. And we've come to a place where, like, before he vents, he'll be like, hey, are you in a space where, like, you could hear me out right now? Or sometimes, like, I'm a venter. I go on rants. I don't, just offload on people. So I've had to kind of train myself to dial it back. And sometimes I'll do it. Like, I'll vent first and then be like, I'm so sorry for, like, dumping all of that. Like, are you even in a space to have this conversation right now? But I've noticed that it's been a slow process in terms of establishing which friends to create that type of boundary with. Because, this most recent situation with the whole setting a boundary thing that I experienced, I think because I didn't set boundaries in this friendship early enough, it kind of boiled over to a point where, like, now we're in this weird space where, like, I don't know if the friendship is going to be a friendship anymore. But this was a person who, he doesn't necessarily vent, but he does like to, he had a habit of, like, he'd call and, like, talk about his day and talk about what he's up to and talk about what he's doing. And, like, it would become very much like, let me offload all these things that I'm doing on you, ask you 1 or 2 questions about how you doing, and then, okay, I'll call you later. Like, it was very much a lot of him and not so much like a, hey, I'm calling to check on you, let's talk as friends. And I try to tread this topic carefully because, like, sometimes people don't know what they're doing or how they have an effect on you or how it's coming off, especially if you're not communicating. And again, because I didn't set boundaries, because I wasn't, saying, hey, this is a problem, it kind of festered up into, like, something much bigger than I think it probably should have been. But there were a lot of boundaries in this friendship that just weren't set, from conversations on the phone to respecting my time to respecting my space. This person at one point, because they needed somebody to stay with when they moved to the state that I live in, ended up living with me, and the live-in situation spiraled out of control. Like, it went from something that was supposed to be a couple of weeks to something that ended up being a couple of months. Like, you and I have personally, on a personal level, spoken about this, but there were so many boundaries that were crossed because I didn't communicate them, because I've been raised in a way to where when you establish boundaries with someone, that means that's the end of it. Like, there's no continuation of the relationship after the boundaries are set, or somebody's upset, or somebody feels disrespected. Now that I'm in therapy, I recognize that a lot of the things that I do to try to avoid those confrontations and that disappointment and all that stuff is a direct response of, like, how I was raised. And you said it earlier in the episode, Caribbean kids, Black kids, like, a lot of people of color are raised in this way. Even, I will say, most millennials are kind of accepting this reality that like our parents did not raise us to feel like we had control over what boundaries we set for ourselves,
Absolutely, absolutely.
especially when it came to them. They were
Oh,
okay
girl.
for the most part with us setting boundaries with other people. So I will say if my mom knew that like I didn't like somebody or like I was uncomfortable in something, like I think for the most part I could tell her like, yeah, I don't want to go by that person house, or like I don't want to be this person friend anymore, and she would respect that. But
Yeah.
if the day ever came where I set a boundary with her or with my father or with any
Mm.
adult in my
That's
life,
considered disrespect.
it was considered disrespect, and it was met
Mm-hmm.
with like, how dare you, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I think so many of us have this issue setting boundaries
Yeah.
and speaking up for ourselves in our adult lives because we relate back to that child who was met with like, you would swear that I was like, yo, granny, back the fuck up off me. Like you would swear.
Right. And you know the thing is, so for one, right? And this is just my genuine opinion again. I feel like that entire generation that raised us, they didn't see us as individuals. They saw us as extensions of them that they could control, right? Little robots that they could program, right? Based on their needs. And obviously that's because that was done to them. You know what I mean? So it's a combination of them just going based on what they know, and then also them finally having the control and being like, well, I'm in charge now. So this is law. You know what I mean? And so for one, that just creates so much fucked up shit up here, because that creates so much confusion. Because even like I said earlier, like I was like we were all essentially like those dogs with the damn collars, and there was that invisible fence. So we know how to not cross other people's boundaries, but then we don't know how to set our own, because there's this confusion and chaos within our own homes where we are allowed to have boundaries, but only with specific people. And the reality is in order for us to understand boundaries and ownership of ourselves, the people who raise us are the first people that should be respecting our boundaries. You know what I mean? Like even like
You know
with
what's
Dylan.
crazy about that though?
What?
Is that they were allowed to set boundaries with us that we
Mm-hmm.
had to respect at all times. You couldn't ask
Mm-hmm.
the adults in your life about their personal lives or when they were
Oh
young.
no, they were
You couldn't,
they were so
yeah,
turned off by that.
you couldn't make jokes with them about certain things. You couldn't, for certain adults, physical contact was a boundary, and they were so comfortable establishing that with us. But we, because like you said, we're seen as property as kids
Mm-hmm.
versus an individual human being, they were fine setting boundaries with us, but we couldn't with them.
Tell me if this was a boundary that the adults around you had, especially my mother. She had this thing about like the seat, like let's say we're at like a family gathering or something. If she was sitting in a chair, she didn't expect anybody, but especially a child, if she got up from that seat and went to go do something and a child sat in that seat, she saw that as the ultimate disrespect. Like I have had my ass handed to me because I sat in a seat that my mom had already sat in. Is that normal or is that just my
I've seen other adults do it. It wasn't necessarily something my mom would bring up, but I've seen other adults do that. Or just like a kid interrupting an adult conversation to like ask for
Mhm.
something, even if they weren't trying to be rude. It could be like, yo, I need to go to the bathroom. Like they
Mhm.
would feel so disrespected for having their bubble
Right.
like interrupted by a child. And it's like, that's a child.
Mhm.
Like they need
That's
you
a
for
literal child.
something. Yeah.
And they can't fend for
Or
themselves.
but for me, especially what I notice about the adults in my life is that like asking them about their past or them sharing anything about like they Caribbean adults, and I can only speak from the Caribbean perspective. I'm sure most people have this experience, but Caribbean adults have these personal lives that exist outside of their immediate families, as it especially as it relates to their children. There
Mhm.
are adults in my life who know so much about the other adults and who how what they were like before I was born, but I feel like I only know those adults in their role as whatever their relation is to
I think
me.
that's across the board. I think no
Yeah.
matter what pocket of the world you come from, that's the reality.
Yeah, it's
I
more
mean,
like a generational thing versus like a demographic thing, I guess. Um
yeah, yeah.
because now like if my niece were to ask me a question about like my experiences in high school and my experiences in college, like if at any point she comes to me and she says like, "Hey, what was dating like for you?" Like anything she wants to ask me, I will feel comfortable telling her because I want her to learn from that experience, and I
Mm-hmm.
want to be able to share with her. But I couldn't just go up to my mother or my aunt and be like, "Yo, when was the first time like what was sex like for you?" And like what kind of
Mm.
learned from your experience, because boom, there's that wall there, like, don't you dare. And it's crazy because like that's your
Yeah.
mother or that's your aunt, like you would expect transparency there, but there's a boundary there instead.
You know what's funny? I do think that they all pick and choose what they're willing to share from their upbringing versus what they're not. Because I'm sure there were things that your mom would be comfortable sharing with you, things
Hmm.
that would put her in the highest light, if that makes sense.
In the
Like,
highest light, or just things that, a lot of it was very comparative. Like my grandmother raised me this, and that. Like she ruled with an iron fist type shit. Just to kind of, it's almost like they'll share the stuff with you that makes you feel like, wow, like I have it good, but they won't share the
yes,
intimate, personal, like I want to get to know you better as a person type
y-
shit.
yeah. I will say for my mom, she was an open book when it came to like her sex life and what her love life was like and things like that. But that's just because that's one of the things that my mom seems to value a lot as a human. So we like I always say that, aside from a lot of my mom's like missteps, one of the things that she took very seriously was sex education, and that's a big part of why Diamond and I ended up not being teen moms and stuff. She was very transparent with us about, sex and making sure that we knew, about condoms and our reproductive system and all that jazz. Um, I feel like she did share things about like whatever her dating life looked like and things like that. But I also feel like there were things and elements about her past that she really didn't share with us. Even just me and Diamond's early years. I only learned as an adult some of the things that she worked so hard to keep as secrets, but those secrets that she was holding on to was driving her crazy. You know what I mean? Because she would have this wild anxiety anytime me and Diamond were around relatives and she wasn't there. She would kind of spiral because she would be worried about them sharing things about her from her past. You know what I mean? And then when if something came up, then it would be a whole bunch of family drama.
Yeah.
But I definitely agree with you that there's always some element about our elders past, particularly our parents. Because by the time our grandparents are grandparents, I think they're way open with their shit because they realize that they're freaking down, like they're gonna die soon.
I
They
think it depends.
probably,
It really depends on the grandparent, because for sure mine still had those boundaries up. And again,
really,
it it blows my mind how strict, or how, passionately, I guess, they protected their own boundaries, but they never
mm,
respected like their grandchildren's boundaries, or the idea
right.
that we could set boundaries.
Mm,
So let's talk about some different types of boundaries. Like let's I guess move on to a different type of boundary setting, because we've talked a lot about emotional boundaries.
yeah.
Um, what are some boundaries that you have set in your life in respect to your time, or in respect to
Mhm.
like your work boundaries? For example, a big boundary for me at work is that I get to decide what type of social life I have with a coworker outside of work. Like that's
Yes.
I don't allow my job to force me into feeling like I have to bring my family into the workspace, or my
Right.
personal life into the workspace. Like I decide where that line is drawn.
Yeah, you know what? I have to say, I think, and even when you were listing out the different types of boundaries earlier, while listening, the easiest boundaries that I've always been able to set is work and time boundaries. There was a time at the beginning of my career where it was a little hard, but it was mostly because I love what I like. I was loving what I was doing so much that it was hard for me to like be like, nope, I'm off the clock. Or, there have been times I've been on a date and like ended my date so that I could help out at work. You know what I mean? But that was because I loved my job at the time. But now, in the last few years, especially after becoming somebody's mama, the easiest boundaries for me to set have always been workplace and time boundaries. And to that, same. I decide who I'm going to interact with outside of the workplace. I don't feel guilty about not wanting to interact with somebody outside of the workplace. I don't regret it either because for me, it's just like we only know each other because of this job, and we both only have this job because of whatever reasons that we have. This once I leave this building, I'm not in this building. I don't want any parts of this building at home with me. You know
Yep.
what I
And
mean?
I'm always very clear about that, even in like and for those of you who might be wondering, like, what are some ways that I can establish a work boundary without making my coworkers feel away or making them feel disrespected? A good place for you to set that boundary to make sure it's established from the beginning is in a job interview, sort of when you first get hired. Typically bosses will do like that one-on-one situation to kind of ask you. Good bosses will have one-on-ones with you to ask you about like your work style, what works for you, what doesn't work for you. When my boss crosses a boundary, or when anybody else crosses a boundary, I try to make sure I'm vocal about it, because it's like, yeah, we cool, but that's the line right there. Like, you need to chill. Especially being one of the few people of color at work, I noticed that I have to establish boundaries more because I have different boundaries versus, let's say, a white coworker.
Right.
For her, when we first started having those one-on-ones, when I first came into the work environment, I was very clear, like, when I leave here at 5 o'clock, like, my phone is like, I don't work here anymore. I don't answer
Period.
emails on weekends. I don't do, unless it's like a pre-plan, like, hey, we have to go to this place on Saturday as a team. Cool.
Mhm.
But I don't, when I leave here, I'm gone. Like, I try to make sure that that work-life balance is a boundary for me, because until this job, I've worked jobs where like that work-life balance didn't exist, and it became very toxic very fast. I've had
Yeah.
bosses who felt like they could call me at 10 o'clock at night to ask a question.
What?
Yeah. Which we probably should have talked about in the first episode of this season, because that was a part of why I said fuck this job, because I was like, hell no, this is not okay. But that happened because I was in undergrad. I felt I was you much younger than this person. This person was my senior. Like, I was scared to set a boundary.
Yeah.
So now I try to respect that. Because I think people don't realize too is that you setting boundaries is a part of your self-love. You setting
Mhm.
boundaries is a
Yep.
part of your self-care. It's a part of your building your respect for yourself. And then you can also set boundaries with yourself. Like,
Hell yeah. And you know what? I want to interject and add something, because I remember earlier when we were kind of describing what boundaries mean to us and stuff. And I remember you using, like, saying that it's like essentially like a wall that you're creating. And I wish I could remember where I heard this. Some spiritual leader that I was listening to, but they pretty much said that there's a big difference between boundaries and walls. Boundaries are essentially a filter where things that benefit you and that you do that benefit others will kind of you can they can pass through. But a wall, you nothing can come in. Oh, I wish I
yeah.
could remember exactly what it was, but pretty much saying when you have boundaries, then that still creates way for things that can benefit you to come in, versus if you have a wall up, then not much can get in. And like you said, I think having boundaries is one of the highest forms of self-care. You know what I mean? And in order for other people to respect your boundaries, you have to respect them. You know? That's just like, it's so necessary.
Time boundaries for me, for sure, probably is my most sacred boundary, mostly because I don't have a whole lot of that shit.
Hello.
So I am
Hello.
very careful with who I give my time to.
Mhm.
Um and that's why I think that's why I touched on the fact that sometimes you have to establish boundaries with yourself, because sometimes I violate my own time boundaries.
Yeah.
Getting enough rest, overworking, working well into the night, not
Mhm.
recognizing when I need to stop. Or convincing myself like I have to finish this thing right now. I can't take a break. I can't go do something else. I can't get some rest. I can't eat. Like, I had
Yeah.
to establish some hard boundaries for myself there so that I could be more cognizant of my own time and, like,
Mhm.
taking care of myself.
And that's necessary. That's absolutely necessary. And I feel like a big part of like time and work boundaries that haven't been set in the past is capitalism, because we're not going to act like the American dream has always been to succeed. And a lot of times we get this idea that if we are not available enough, then we might miss out on these big opportunities. And you know what I mean? Like, think about like The Devil Wears Prada, right? That's so normal and common in like rising professionals. You know what I mean? And I feel like it took enough burnout for our generation to realize, like, yeah, no, this is just not going to work. You know what I mean? Like, this is a big, these opportunities that people don't want to miss are a big part of why a lot of our elders have not been available enough to their families and things such as that. And it's just not going to fly no more.
Yep.
It's really not.
I listen, this past year has been such a big just period of self-reflection for me, and I think for a lot of people, in terms of like what your boundaries are and should be. Work-life balance, like you said, has definitely come into question. My boundaries with myself and how I spend my time, my boundaries with other people and what access I let them have to me. I mean,
Yeah.
the conversation of 2020 was boundaries, right? Like physical boundaries, because we were recognizing that, okay, you need to be 6 feet away from me. And right now you like 6 inches, bitch. Boundary. Like back the fuck
Hello.
up. So
Hello.
it kind of makes you think about just like other boundaries that people violate on a regular basis. So we're getting close to the end of the episode, and before we leave, I do kind of want to leave some tips for people who have listened to this episode and want to work on establishing some boundaries for themselves in their relationships. So an example of setting a boundary, we've talked about a lot during the episode, but for me, an example of setting a boundary is establishing the word no as a complete sentence.
That's
So
fair.
a boundary can be when you tell someone that you can't do something, or you don't want to do something, you don't want to go somewhere, avoiding over explaining yourself to try to make that person feel better about the fact that you're saying no. So viewing no as like, no, I just don't want to go. Like, I'll see you next time. It's fine.
Yeah.
Like, not explaining, oh, I sick, oh, I just don't feel good. Like, don't lie to that person or to yourself. It's okay to say no, and establishing a boundary can be accepting the fact that it's okay to say no as a complete sentence.
Yeah, that's fair. So that's a good one. I think for those who do struggle with that, because that's realistically, we both know that's a lot easier said than done. So rather than over explaining, a better thing to do would just be like, not this time, or I just don't feel like it, or even just simply maybe next time. You know what I mean? If you have a hard time just being like, no, girl. You know what I mean?
And I mean, no, well, I don't mean no in like a blunt, like, nah, me ain't going. Just like how you just said, maybe next time, I just don't feel like going. Like, being honest with yourself and that person about the fact that you just don't want to go, or you just don't want to do it, or you just
right.
don't want to
I'm not
take
in
on
the
a new
mood this
project.
time.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
For example, Diamond was visiting me not too long ago, and I was in a fucking mood, okay?
Mhm.
A lot of shit was going on. And she came in the room and she was like, hey, do you want to hang and have sister time? And I felt so bad, but like, I was like, Diamond, I'm not in a good mood right now. I don't want to socialize. And because Diamond and I have this understanding of like boundaries, and we have that respect for each other, Diamond was like, okay, I'll see you in a bit, okay? She was like, I'll come back to check on you. I said, okay. And that was it. We
Yeah.
didn't get mad at each
Right.
other. She didn't feel no type of way. It was just like, I can't do this right now. I'll see you later.
And that's
Like,
fair. Absolutely. Yeah. Um, so what other tips would you recommend?
establishing your boundaries with your friends early. Obviously we have friends that we've known for long periods of time, but when you meet new people, establishing the boundary the first time they cross it, communicating that boundary so that it doesn't have to build up to the point where you have to do it in an angry way. So let's say you went out to drink with some friends, somebody got a little too physically comfortable with you, they were hugging up on you. Like, for me, I'm not a hugger. I've had new people meet me and be like, oh my God, you're so cool, and try to hug me. And I'm like, I'm not a hugger. Sorry. Like, you good. Don't hug me.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are thrown off by that. But because I do that early, people know not to like keep trying me. Another good one is, especially for us VI people, boundaries with our dialect, the way we speak.
Oh,
when people,
yes.
So when people
Oh, you know
mimic
what?
the way
When people
you
try
speak,
to do that Caribbean accent, I tell them, please don't do that. It's
yep,
offensive. And I don't give a fuck. Like,
and that's
I
a
don't.
boundary. That
It's
is
a
a
hard
boundary.
boundary. It's
a
very
hard
offensive.
boundary.
Like a lot, especially,
Mm-hmm.
and this was something I did experience in my workplace a lot, where when I would introduce myself, or they'd be like, so where are you from? Are you from Jamaica, man? And I'm like, please don't do that. That's very offensive. Like, and then I would also just kind of let them know, you don't have to try to speak with an accent. I understand standard American English perfectly fine.
And that's an example of a boundary. Another tip that I would say is to be consistent with your boundaries. So
Yes.
don't establish a boundary with someone or about something the first time and then allow them to cross that boundary the second time and then decide to,
Yeah.
like, you have to make sure that even if a person because people are not just going to accept your boundary every time. People are not just going to
Yeah,
be
you're
like, "Oh
gonna
my
have to
god, sorry."
remind
Yeah.
them.
"Oh my god, sorry, I won't do it again." Because we're human. Sometimes people forget, but also sometimes people think that if they push hard enough, that they will be able to convince you to put that boundary down and to let it go. So you have to continue expressing like, "Hey, I don't like this shit. Let
And
me
you
let
know
me
what?
just."
To piggyback on that, I want to touch base on what you said earlier about setting your own personal boundaries. You have to create a boundary within yourself of how many times are you willing to accept someone crossing a boundary, like, because you shouldn't have to repeat your boundaries too much. Now it's one thing the first couple times, but if you find that somebody has been thoroughly advised of your boundaries and they're still doing what they want to do, make sure you take in the message, boo.
Yeah.
Make sure you
That's
deciding who gets to eat at your table.
Listen, boundary setting is a great way to re-examine your friendships and re-examine the people that you want to have relationships with. Because if a
Yes.
person cannot do something as simple as respect a boundary that you set, then that person does not have respect for you. Because it
Oh,
doesn't matter what the boundary is. That's another thing I want to explain to people. Your boundary can be whatever the fuck you want it to be.
because
Like,
it's your personal boundary. And
exactly.
the
It
and the
doesn't have to make sense to the person that you setting it with. They have
mhm.
to, all they have to do is respect it. So, like the accent thing, a lot of people won't see that as a big deal. Like, well, I was just joking. Like, cool. Don't do it again though, because that's a
Mhm.
boundary. Like,
Yeah. And you
so
know what? The beauty in that, right? Because one of my favorite quotes is your vibe attracts your tribe, right? And so part of that, at least in my personal opinion, is as you set boundaries on people, either respect them or not, then for those who disrespect those boundaries, then you get to decide within yourself if they're even worth being in your life. And then as you continue to do that, people who will respect your boundaries, you'll find that they're there. You know what I mean? And they'll end up in your life because I'm sorry, like me personally, like I said earlier, like it's very easy for me to respect people's boundaries. So if I say something or make some kind of a joke and somebody's like, hey, that ain't it, I'm like, oh, my bad. I don't even feel the need to express that. Oh, but I was just joking and did it because it ain't got nothing to do with me. That's your boundary. You don't want me
yeah.
making, I'm just not going to do it no more. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
And we have to be, like you said, we have to kind of come to a place with ourselves where we recognize other people will set boundaries with us and sometimes we'll cross those things. And no matter how that shit make you feel, even if you embarrass, even if you feeling some type of way about them establishing a boundary, like you have to kind of take your pride out of it and accept like this
Mm-hmm.
person set a boundary, I have to respect it. Like,
Exactly.
and that's that. So if you are listening to this episode, we have reached the end of our time, but I want you guys to share some examples of your own personal boundaries on social media with us. So tag us at Good Up Pod, use hashtag Good Up Tuesday on Twitter, on Instagram, or on Facebook, and let us know like some examples of your personal boundaries. So for example, if you don't let your coworkers follow you on social media, that's a boundary. If you don't
Period.
let, people ask you certain personal questions, that's a boundary. Share your different types of boundaries with us. We'll make sure to respond to you and share them on our pages. But thank you guys so much for like listening, for supporting the podcast, for downloading the podcast, for being patrons of the podcast. If you want to be a patron and get exclusive content and get our episodes early and get bonus content and join our Facebook group to talk shit with us about the episodes, then go to patreon.com/goodupodcast, and make sure you sign up. It's literally $3 a month. The cheapest level is $3 a month. So you're getting some bang for your buck, girl. You have $3. You have
Do
$3.
you? Do they? Because I ain't got it. I'm gonna ask
$3
Dylan to borrow
a month?
$3. I just
$3 a
messing with you.
month?
I just messing with you. I just messing with you.
But yeah, we will see you guys next week. Deidre, anything you want to tell the people and before we leave?
I love all of you. Every
Aw.
single one of you. I really do. And I can't wait to talk to y'all next week. Bye.